Arizona's death row holds only 3 women, but their crimes are some of the most brutal and disturbing you'll ever hear. Samantha Allen. She received the death penalty for the murder of her 10-year-old cousin, Amy Deal. Deal's family members had abused her for a long time. Shirley Deal, who was married to David Deal, gave birth to Amy Lynn Deal in Pennsylvania on July 24, 2000. It is unclear whether David Deal is actually Amy's father because Shirley claimed that she was seeing another man when she became pregnant. Before Amy was born, Shirley and David had 2 other children together. They shared a home, but she at some point left her husband and moved in with her mother. Shirley and the kids eventually moved back to Midland, Texas, where they resided with David's sister, Cynthia Stoltzman, and his mother, Judith Deal. Shirley says David's family did not mistreat the children, even though they treated her like a slave, swore at her, and beat her. Shirley also says she was thrown out by the family and moved to Kansas without her kids. According to neighbors, Amy was frequently mistreated and was made to walk barefoot back and forth on the pavement in the scorching Phoenix heat. In one case, Amy had been forced to spend 15 minutes walking barefoot on the blazing sidewalk at 114-degree heat. She was also made to eat dog waste and hot sauce, crushed metal cans while barefoot, and trashed with a paddle they nicknamed the Butt Buster. As a punishment for bedwetting, Amy was also made to sleep on the shower floor without any blankets. Among other places, the family had resided in Tucson, Arizona, Utah, Texas, and Pennsylvania. The disgusting conditions of the family's Wisconsin home prompted the local Child Protective Services to be contacted. Before relocating to Arizona, the family lived in Utah, where school officials said they had informed the authorities of numerous cases of child abuse and neglect. According to the school administrators, Amy and her siblings arrived at school dirty. They said that Amy had cat urine on her shoes once and that she frequently had head lice. Amy appeared to be the family's scapegoat, according to the school administration. She and the other kids were allegedly homeschooled while they were residing in Phoenix. Amy's father, David, and his 2 other kids were living in a tent in the rear of the family rental house. Amy was the only victim of abuse among all the children in the house. According to the police, the other kids set up scenarios to get Amy into trouble. Additionally, the kids were convinced to tell the authorities a fabrication about how and why Amy landed up in the Foot Locker. The response to the question of why Amy had such poor treatment was that she was mentally slow. With virtually little clothing on, the kids were frequently spotted walking the streets until quite late at night. Sometimes they didn't have shoes or diapers. Amy Deal was discovered dead in her own sweat and urine inside a small plastic footlocker in a sweltering garage on July 12, 2011, when police were called to her residence. Dehydration and heat exhaustion contributed to her death by suffocation. Amy had been living with her aunt, Cynthia Stoltzman, 44, who was also her legal guardian, and her grandmother, Judith Deal. Cynthia Stoltzman's daughter, Samantha, and her son-in-law, John Allen, both 23, and 12 or more children also resided there. After the adults had gone to bed in the previous evening, Amy had locked herself in the footlocker while playing hide-and-seek, according to the family's initial story. They all said that the following day they discovered Amy dead in the crate. Amy was found extremely filthy and with injuries on her left leg from the trunk's forceful contact, leading the police to assume foul play. After some time spent being questioned, Samantha and John Allen admitted to locking Amy in the trunk as a punishment for taking a popsicle without permission. Given that the trunk was less than 3 feet long and only 1 foot wide and deep, Amy, who weighed 59 pounds and was 4 feet 2 inches tall, had to be crammed into it. She had to run around in 103-degree heat for more than an hour and perform backbends and jumping jacks before being shoved into the trunk. Then a padlock from the backyard fence was used to lock the trunk. The family allegedly abused Amy because they didn't think she was in fact a blood relative, according to the police. On July 27, 2011, Samantha and John Allen were taken into custody for murder. Since both Cynthia Stoltzman and Judith Deal acknowledged that they had previously locked Amy in the trunk, they were taken into custody on charges of kidnapping and child cruelty. The bail bonds for John Allen and Samantha were each set at $1 million. The bond for Cynthia Stoltzman and her mother was set at $500,000 each. David Deal requested money from friends and relatives a few days after the arrests in order to release his sister or his mother, Judith Deal. David Martin Deal pleaded guilty to attempted child abuse and was sentenced to 14 years in prison on July 6, 2013, but he was not accused in his daughter's death. Cynthia Stoltzman received a life sentence of probation and a 24-year prison sentence. Judith Deal received a 10-year prison term along with a life sentence of probation. On August 7, 2017, Samantha Allen was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 74 years in prison for child abuse and conspiracy to conduct child abuse. She was also given a death by lethal injection sentence. John Allen was also sentenced to death by lethal injection on November 17, 2017, after being found guilty of murder on November 8. Wendy Andriano. She was convicted of the 2000 murder of her terminally ill husband, Joe. Wendy married Joseph Andriano in January 1994. Joe became unwell shortly after they were married. In 1998, he was given an adenoid cystic cancer diagnosis. His sickness had progressed to a fatal stage by then. After trying homeopathic treatments for his disease, Joe turned to chemotherapy in 2000. Wendy was working as an apartment manager and had 2 kids by then, but she started to dislike her enormous responsibility. She began going out to bars and having affairs. Although no life insurance was ever bought, she and her husband asked a friend to pretend to be her husband during the pre-screening procedures. In the early hours of October 8, 2000, Wendy Andriano stabbed her husband Joe, 33, in the neck with a 13-inch knife and bludgeoned him to death with a bar stool in their residence. 23 blows to the skull were discovered during his examination, and there was also evidence of sodium azide in his blood. At the request of a co-worker, Joe's wife Wendy had contacted 911 about an hour prior to his murder, stating that her husband was dying. Wendy, however, refused paramedics when they arrived, claiming that Joe had the do not resuscitate order and that he wanted to pass away. The paramedics departed the area. Wendy contacted 911 once more an hour later, claiming that she had killed her husband by beating and stabbing him in self-defense. She also claimed that she had been subjected to psychological and physical abuse by her spouse, but Joe couldn't protect himself since he was too weak from the sodium azide toxicity and chemotherapy. Wendy Andriano's murder trial started on August 23, 2004, 4 years after the event. She faced the death penalty for her crime even though she had no previous criminal history. According to the prosecution, Wendy killed her husband for financial gain. Her attempt to instate a life insurance policy on her terminally ill spouse was cited as evidence. Prosecutors also claimed that she was lured in by the possibility of a sizable payout from a medical malpractice case brought against Joe's physicians. They tried to demonstrate that Wendy poisoned her husband with sodium azide, a pesticide, so that Joe's death would seem to have been caused by a heart attack. Wendy testified in her own defense during the trial. She claimed that her spouse had abused her during her 9 days on the witness stand. She added that when she told her husband Joe about one of her affairs, he became furious. She said that the knife was used in a struggle. Wendy's jury convicted her of first-degree murder on November 18, 2004, despite her passionate testimony. She was sentenced a month later. On December 22, 2004, she was condemned to death by lethal injection due to the cruelty and depravity of the crime, as well as the fact that the murder was motivated by money. Shauna Forde. Forde was convicted for a 2009 crime that resulted in the violent murders of Raul Flores and his 9-year-old daughter Brisenia. Raul Flores Jr., 29, and his daughter Brisenia Ileana Flores, 9 years old, were killed on May 30, 2009 in Arivaca, Arizona during a home invasion. Shauna Forde, Jason Eugene Bush, and Albert Gacciola were the culprits. They were all members of Forde's vigilante nativist organization, Minutemen American Defense, MAD. Gina Gonzalez, the victim's mother and wife, was wounded but survived the assault after exchanging gunfire with the attackers. By pretending to be law enforcement agents searching for fugitives, Shauna Forde and her accomplices were able to enter the Flores residence. In order to fund Forde's vigilante nativist organization, MAD, which patrolled Arizona's border with Mexico, the accused were hoping to obtain cash and drugs that could be sold. The intruders seized cheap jewelry and shot 29-year-old Raul Flores Jr. and his daughter Brisenia after discovering there were no drugs in the house. Brisenia's mother and Raul Flores' wife, Gina Maria Gonzalez, 31, was shot 3 times when she was inside the house during the assault. She pretended to be dead in order to survive. Gonzalez armed herself with her husband's weapon and dialed 911 after the attackers had left the house. The attackers returned to the house while Gonzalez was on the phone, and she shot Bush in the leg in the process. Then the murderers ran away. Gonzalez named the attackers as a Caucasian woman and 2 guys. She pointed to Bush as the murderer of her husband and child. Chuck Stonex, a member of MAD, treated Bush's leg the day after the killings. Stonex later testified at trial as a prosecution witness. At the time of her passing, Brisenia was a 3rd grader at Amado, Arizona's Sopori Elementary School. When the attack occurred, a 12-year-old daughter of the Flores family was at her grandmother's house in Sahuarita. Juror Angie Thomas said it was challenging to reach a decision to execute Forde. The result was heavily influenced by a picture of Brisenia that was shown during the trial. A little girl wearing a white t-shirt and turquoise-colored pajama bottoms. She had bright red fingernails and she was sitting on a love seat. Up until you notice that half of her face had been blasted off, the photo appears beautiful and innocent. Gonzalez stated that as her daughter was pleading for her life, she was shot point blank. Gacciola, Bush, and Forde were all found guilty of the killings. Gacciola received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole plus 54 years, while Forde and Bush received death sentences. Shauna Forde was born on December 6, 1967. In 2007, when she unsuccessfully applied for a position on the Everett, Washington City Council, Forde described herself as a former youth counselor, cosmetologist, and employee of an aircraft manufacturer, as well as a promoter of a grunge rock band. Before being arrested for the double murder, Forde had a number of run-ins with the law. According to court documents, she was incarcerated as a teenager for multiple charges related to prostitution, larceny, and burglary. Forde had 4 previous marriages. In 1989, a male friend said she had physically assaulted him and threatened to use a knife to harm herself. She was also accused of theft in 2007. Forde accused drug cartel members of shooting and assailing her in January 2008. However, she then implied that her son's criminal friends were the culprits. Authorities closed the case because of insufficient evidence after Forde's brother's claims that she made up the allegation. Following her expulsion from the Minuteman Civil Defense Corps, MCDC, in 2007, Forde became active in vigilante operations. She assisted in funding and leading MAD, an MSDC breakaway group. The group allegedly had several thousand private members, but a former member stated that once Forde was arrested for the Flores murders, there were only 14 left. Forde was updating the Minuteman Project website, where she was described as the border operations manager for Jim Gilchrist Company. According to StoneX, Forde planned to provide funding for the acquisition of a 40-acre plot of land in southern Arizona, where she had planned to set up a base for her group's border operations. Shauna Forde was convicted on all 8 of the charges against her on February 14, 2011. According to Eric Larson, Forde's attorney, she shouldn't have been convicted because she wasn't present in the residence when Flores and his daughter were killed. Gonzalez testified that Forde was present when the 2 men broke into the Flores' house, as claimed by the prosecution. She was the one in charge, even if she didn't put a gun to Brisenia's head. What do you think justice looks like in cases like these? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.